Okay, everyone, we'll get started right now. So thank you to everyone that has joined us. We may have some folks join a little bit later, but we'll go ahead and get started. So I am sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right. You know what, let's back up a little bit. So let's get started with just a little bit of housekeeping. So everyone is going to be muted during the broadcast just to keep background noise down, etc. If you have any comments during the session, please use the chat tool. For webinar sessions, as opposed to Zoom calls, for those of you that haven't done a lot of Zoom webinars, you have more tools than you're used to seeing. So you'll see Q&A, and we're going to use that as well. But for any just comments or, hey, Liza, I can't hear you, things like that, use the chat tool. You may have to click the button that shows 3 ellipses and the word more underneath in order to pull up chat. Now we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the broadcast. So I'll plan to get through as many of your questions as I can in our allotted 90-minute time this morning. So any questions that you are coming to today's session with around diversity, equity, inclusion related topics, go ahead and stick those in the Q&A tool. So that'll be in your Zoom toolbar, kind of right in the middle. Q&A, it's got two little like talking bubbles next to it. All of your questions will show up anonymously. And if somebody already asked your question, so you see your question already asked in Q&A, you can upvote it, get it closer to the top. The more folks that upvote a particular question, the closer it is to the top and the more likely I am to be able to get to your question at the end of today's session. Fantastic. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So now that we're done with housekeeping, I'll introduce myself really quickly. My name is Liza Town. I'm an HR consultant, and I'm coming to you live from the Great Plains of the Midwest. So I'm outside of Omaha, Nebraska. So not too far from Denver, where I know most of you are located or in that area. So today, we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So at a high level, here's what we want to cover today. First, we'll talk about the why we're here. Why is this topic so important? Second, we'll talk about what you need to know about DE&I strategies and best practices, and how you can help create an intentional culture with positive DE&I outcomes for your organization. So here's what we want to accomplish together today. We want to understand the bottom line outcomes that result from strong diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. We want to work on shifting the mindset from DE&I as kind of a check the box activity that folks are expected to do to really a business imperative. We're going to talk about why we think that diversity, equity, and inclusion are really imperative to every type of business. We'll talk about how to create intentional DE&I strategy that focuses on business outcomes and not just initiatives. We'll give you the tools that you need to create a thriving culture rooted in DE&I best practices and empower you to create an inclusive work environment. We want everyone to feel comfortable to bring their best selves to work. And by creating that inclusive environment, this is how we work towards that. And we'll move towards a true transformation in your organization. So we have one question in chat I'll answer. Will we receive a copy of the presentation after the session? Yes, you will. Absolutely. Great question. So don't feel like you have to furiously take notes. When we get to the strategy section, you'll have all of this to refer back to. Thanks for asking. Okay. So let's jump right in. So why do diversity, equity, and inclusion matter? Why is this even important to talk about? So McKinsey and Company have been examining diversity in the workplace for several years. So in the latest report, Diversity Matters, they found that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are actually 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. Companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 15% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. So you can see that information in the exhibit here. on this slide. We've also found that diverse companies experience 3 times more cash flow per employee compared to their less diverse peers. It's kind of a big deal. Let's talk about expanding customer base, right? So Accenture reports that 70% of millennial age consumers, definitely the one of the larger consumer groups, are more likely to choose one brand over another if that brand demonstrates inclusion and diversity in its products, its services, promotions, in-store experiences. So diversity is really important to millennial customers and consumers, right? So increasing diversity opens up new customer markets. We know that. Vendors, other businesses, partners look for organizations that understand an increasingly multicultural, multifaceted customer base, can demonstrate cultural intelligence. And we'll talk about that a little further as well, and that are aligned by shared values. So a diverse team is much better equipped to connect your customers to your brand. Okay. As far as attracting folks to your brand, you want to attract consumers, you want to attract customers, you also want to attract the top talent, right? The best folks to fill your open roles and to be your brand ambassadors. So diversity in organizations opens the talent pool to a wider, more competitive market of applicants. It increases likelihood of finding candidates with knowledge, skills, abilities that really align with job demands. So Glassdoor reported that 72% of women versus 62% of men, 89% of African Americans, 80% of Asians, 70% of Latinos ranked workforce diversity as really important in their job search. And we know that millennial and Generation Z generations are the most diverse generations in history. Diversity in the workforce means having a multitude of different cultures, educational backgrounds, and points of view present in the workforce. So cultural, educational, conceptual perspectives provide richness of ideas that lead to stronger outcomes. That makes diversity a proven ingredient between creativity, innovation. A lack of diversity in leadership in an organization really hampers the organization from being as innovative as they could. So Harvard Business Review reports that companies without diverse leadership, women are 20% less likely than their straight male counterparts to win endorsement for their ideas. People of color are 24% less likely than straight male counterparts to win endorsement for ideas. And those who identify as LGBTQ are 21% less likely. So a monocultural workforce is susceptible to groupthink, right? When we're all in a working environment, in a culture where we're all kind of thinking the same, we're from the same kind of, cultural background, we all seem to kind of think the same way, right? There's some diversity in thought, but when you don't have more than one culture present in a workforce, you kind of start all thinking the same. That makes it really hard to innovate, right? So diversity in the workforce provides multiple sources of inspiration, different points of view, better reflecting the diverse perspectives in increasingly complex and multifaceted world. So why aren't more companies doing, something about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Why are we not realizing the benefits of these practices? A lot of leaders claim that, they're just too busy, right? 41% of leaders at Fortune 1000 companies claim that they weren't implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives because they were too busy. It just wasn't paramount. Okay, 43% of US workers, though, believe discussions about race are inappropriate at work. So there's still a sentiment of, we can't talk about this. We can't talk about race. I can't talk about what makes me different from you in the workplace. And that's simply not true if we go about it the right way. So that's really what we're here today to talk about and hopefully accomplish. So let's define, diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are words that, we hear a lot when we are talking about, making changes that are positive culturally in the workplace. But it's important to clarify that diversity, equity, and inclusion are each unique terms and concepts, right? They come with unique strategies when we talk about how to implement these in our business practice. So people tend to use these terms interchangeably, lump them together in the same strategy. We don't have to do that, right? You also don't have to boil the ocean. All of these may not be an issue at your organization, right? So you just pick out the things that you feel are opportunities and work on those. So diversity defined is the representation of different thoughts, opinions, and types of people in an organization. Where inclusion means that individuals with different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted and welcomed, right? So you can have a diverse workforce without having an inclusive workforce, right? And then equity means that everyone in the organization receives fair and equal treatment and has equal access to opportunities in the workforce. So I think this is really, kind of a simple slide, but it proves a really good point, right? Workplace diversity does not equal workplace inclusion, right? So we're diverse if we have people from lots of different backgrounds, right? Racial, cultural, ethnic backgrounds, etc. But what you see is just kind of a scattered mess, right? So when you talk about having diversity and then implementing inclusion, suddenly all these pieces start to fit together. So when you talk about equality and equity, these two get jumbled up a lot together as well. So equality means equal opportunity, where equity means equal access. So in this image, the person on the left is taller, and that's a privilege, right? So they're able to reach what the shortest person can't get to. In the image to the right, when the less privileged are armed with the resources that offer the same opportunities as their peers, fairness is achieved. So in other words, equality is the end goal, right? And equity is the means to get there. All right, so let's jump into some strategies and best practices. So when we're talking about diversity specifically, we'll talk about some diversity statistics in the United States first. So 97% of senior executive boards in the US fail to reflect the country's labor force and population demographics, right? They're overwhelmingly, white and male. 4.8%, and this is as of March of 2019, 4.8% of Fortune 500 CEOs are female. So that's up from 2.4% in 2008, right? So that's a nice little jump, right? But that means that only 25 CEOs in that Fortune 500 group are female. 20% of companies don't have female leaders, and 50% of organizations don't have people of color in leadership roles. So diversity is about more than just race and gender. So in the workplace, it means that an organization employs a diverse team of people that is reflective of the society which it exists in and operates in, right? So you're talking about not just race or gender, but disability status, nationality, age, education, socioeconomic status, right? What background are folks from? Ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. There's a whole lot more. Diversity can, be seen and also unseen, right? So a couple of diversity strategies that really aren't effective, right? That high profile diversity hire, right? Where it's like here's this one person of color, right? Or this one very visible person in our leadership group. That doesn't really yield a business outcome because the rest of the group doesn't look like that or reflect that diversity. Diversity in your marketing materials that don't reflect your actual workforce. Or being colorblind. We've got a little bit of information further into the session on being colorblind, and why that terminology and that kind of stance in this day and age doesn't really get you the outcome that you're looking for. So some strategies to achieve diversity. This is where you don't have to madly write notes because you'll get a copy of this. You know, a good idea, conduct an internal benchmarking of each location and compare that with internal data. So what does the market that you're, you know, the community, the market that you're serving look like compared to the folks that you have serving that community? Are management roles primarily filled by older white males? Does the accounting department tend to hire only females? The Denver location, if you have one, is that primarily white, or does it reflect the diversity in the Denver area? After you've done that, set some realistic goals and build intentional hiring strategies to reach members of the populations that aren't necessarily reflected. Embed diversity practices into existing recruiting processes. So this is really important, and we'll talk more about recruiting as well. Creating partnerships with minority-owned third-party recruiting firms is a great way to drive diversity in your talent acquisition effort. Establishing long-term relationships with minority organizations in your industry, in your community, just to say, hey, we're here. You know, we're interested in reaching out to you and working with your community. Advertising on minority job boards, publications, etc., and encouraging and rewarding diversity in your employee referral program. So, for example, let's take a peek at Colorado's diversity mix. So, you know, Colorado is becoming increasingly more diverse. So we're, you know, right in the middle here, 2020. Right now, you know, when it comes to race and ethnicity of folks in Colorado, still about 66.3% white, 4% Black, 22, almost 23% Latinx, Latino, Latina, etc. So, but as you see, you know, by the time we're at 2030, 2040, 2050, we're going to go from about 66% white to 52% white. So it's a, you know, it's a big difference, right? That's a big shift in ethnicity and, you know, racial division in Colorado. It's important to look forward toward the future and kind of where that trend is taking us. So some more strategies to achieve diversity. You know, when you want to attract diverse candidates, you have to be able to demonstrate that your culture and workforce are going to welcome and embrace them, right? So, you know, demonstrating that in your hiring process means post diversity statements, cultural practices on your website and your career page. At the end of the session, we have a really neat example of how one company has done just that, and it's had a great impact on them. Highlight employee benefits that promote and support equity, and use employee testimonial videos if those make sense on your website. Create diverse interview teams. So it shouldn't all just be, you know, older white men, younger white females, etc., doing the interviewing. Make sure that you have kind of a mix of different ages, races, genders, sexual orientations, etc., and conduct some bias training for your folks that are making the hiring decisions. Speaking of bias training, let's talk about that a little bit. So we won't go too in depth into bias today, but I think this is a really important topic and one that, you know, can make some folks uncomfortable, but it is really helpful to kind of peel off a couple layers and talk about, you know, bias. We're going to start out with a little activity. So we'll get you guys kind of thinking. When we do these sessions face to face, we have a handout that we use. You know, obviously today that's not going to happen, but this is what this handout looks like. So we'll have you either jot this down if you have a pen and paper around you. Jot this down, right? Write a list of your 5 closest friends, the 5 people that are closest to you outside of your immediate family, right? And identify their characteristics. So your 5 closest friends, how old are they? What gender are they? Race, sexual orientation, education, you know, do they all have college degrees? Do none of them have degrees? You know, marital status, do they have kids or not? And we'll give everyone a couple minutes to either kind of think this through in your mind or write it down. And then we're going to ask a question of you. So while folks are writing down, I'll just Take a look at the chat and make sure I haven't missed anything. Nope. Fantastic. Okay. All right. So those 5 people that are closest to you, you've thought about their characteristics. So we're just going to ask you really quickly, how similar are your closest friends to you? So you should see a poll that just launched on your screen. Answers are completely anonymous, so I can't tell who said what. Please be very honest, right? Are they the completely same as you? Are they very similar to you, your 5 closest friends? Somewhat similar, right? Or not at all similar to you? And we'll give it another, oh, I don't know, 10 seconds before we close the poll. Okay, cool. So I'm going to end the poll and I'll share the results with you guys here. So this is cool. And it depends on the group that we do this exercise with. Sometimes what we see is the majority of folks say, the people closest to them are, completely the same or very similar. And we see that, right? 33, so what, 39% of you said that, the folks closest to you are very similar or completely the same as you. What I see with this group that I think is really neat is over half of you said that your friends are just somewhat similar to you, right? So maybe they're not all the same age. Maybe they're not all the same gender as you. Maybe some of you have kids, some of you don't. Some of you have that master's degree, some of you have an associate's, etc. So that's really cool. So I'm going to stop sharing these results. So the reason that we do that little exercise is to really talk about, why intention matters. We tend to gravitate towards folks that are more like us, right? Either they look like us, they think like us, they're from a background that is similar to ours. Because we get them, we understand that, right? It makes us more comfortable. And not all of us are comfortable kind of going off and, creating more diverse relationships, with folks that maybe aren't folks that we would have grown up with, for example, gone to school with. So that's why we do that exercise, just to kind of check and see, get a baseline of where we are. So let's talk a little bit about bias, right? So implicit bias or unconscious bias, it's a term that's used to describe the associations that we hold, right? Which are, outside our conscious awareness, but they're in there, that can have a significant influence on our attitudes, on our behavior in work and outside of work. So regardless of how fair-minded we believe ourselves to be, most people have some degree of unconscious bias on board, right? That means that we automatically respond to others, so people from different racial or ethnic groups, in either positive or negative ways, depending on those implicit biases that we carry. Associations like that are really difficult to override, regardless of whether we recognize them to be wrong or, maybe not incorrect. They're really deeply ingrained into our thinking, into our emotions. So unconscious or implicit bias operates outside of our awareness. We don't even know what's happening. It's just kind of there. It's inbred and it's ingrained in our minds. It can be in direct contradiction to our spouse beliefs, that our values that we would think, consciously or say out loud. So conscious bias, explicit bias, a little bit different, right? With explicit or conscious bias, the person is very clear about their feelings and their attitudes. The related behaviors that you could see are conducted with intent. Conscious bias is characterized by overt negative behavior or through more subtle means, such as exclusion of folks that are different. So here's what we know. There is science around unconscious bias. So unconscious biases develop at an early age. We do know that. Biases emerge during middle childhood and appear to develop further across childhood. Unconscious biases have real-world effects on behavior. And unconscious biases are malleable, right? We can take steps to minimize the impact of those things in our lives. So that's the good news here. So bias may have an impact on hiring and mentoring opportunities. So there's a lot of research that's been published demonstrating impact of unconscious bias in various domains, right, including criminal justice system, education, healthcare hiring, etc. One study showed that fictitious resumes with white sounding names and African American sounding names were sent in response to a job posting. Resumes with the white sounding names received 50% more callbacks for interviews. So there weren't any real differences in the resumes besides the name. Okay, but the folks with whiter sounding names received 50% more callbacks. Another study, hiring managers rated male applicants for a laboratory manager position as more competent than their equally skilled female counterparts. The hiring managers also selected a higher starting salary, offered more career mentoring to the male applicants. So, how can I address my biases if I don't know I have them? The I don't know I have them argument really is becoming less and less of a valid excuse for unconscious biases. It does take work, it takes intention and commitment, but if you want to be a part of fostering in an inclusive world, it truly does start with kind of doing our own work. So here's some steps on how we can work to combat our own unconscious bias. So assume that you have them, right? Because we all do. It's a thing. It happens. We can't help it. It happened in childhood, right? Just assume that you have them. They're there. So once you can assume that and admit that, conduct some research on yourself, right? So what are some behaviors that suggest you may have some hidden bias around particular groups? If you are a person that makes hiring decisions, do you hire the same type of people all the time? Do you find racial, ethnic, gender, LGBT differences something that you would rather not talk about or address? Are you part of that 41% that still feels really uncomfortable having discussions about diversity in the workplace? Do you laugh at jokes about other groups? So step 3, make a list of groups that are different from you and the groups that you feel like you belong to. So it's human nature to be more positive about groups that we are part of, right, than groups that we're not. But the groups that you're different than, do you interact with those groups? Do you know much about the other groups? What adjectives would you use to describe the other groups on your list? Step 4, ask a trusted friend or an associate how they perceive you, right? So you've taken a look at yourself. Now ask someone else for their opinion, right? Someone you trust to give it to you straight. This can be really challenging, but ask them, what are some behaviors that they've noticed with you that might suggest that you have an unconscious bias about a particular group, right? Go ask your manager at work. If you're somebody that makes hiring decisions, ask your manager if they've seen anything that would indicate that you might have an unconscious bias. And then number 5, examine your worldview, right? Do you tend to think in absolutes, right and wrong, good and bad? Is there no gray area? Or do you think in more relative terms, right? Do you tend to make quick judgments about what you see? Or are you more reflective when you have a little more information? When you see behaviors that are different, do you interpret them from your cultural lens? Or do you describe them in neutral terms until you have additional information? So another way to kind of conduct your own research on unconscious bias, you can go to understandingprejudice.org. And again, we'll send this information out after the session. They've got some really cool, they're called an IAT, or an implicit association test. And there are a few different tests that you can take, right? There's one on race, there's one on gender stereotyping, etc. Kind of a cool way to do this for yourself, do it for your team at work. Okay. Now, before we go any further, I just want to do another quick shout out. We will have a Q&A session when we're done today. We do have one good question in Q&A right now, and I would love to see some more. So, if you see a question that you want answered, upvote it, give it a little thumbs up, move it to the top of the list there, okay? All right. Okay, so let's talk about inclusion strategies and best practices. It's a great quote. I love it. You can mandate diversity, but you can't mandate inclusion. Inclusion is about behavior and relationships. You have to change hearts and minds. So Harvard Business Group research identified these 6 traits that distinguish inclusive leaders from others. So inclusive leaders show visible commitment. So that means they articulate authentic commitment to diversity, challenge the status quo, hold others accountable, and make diversity and inclusion a personal priority. Inclusive leaders show humility. So they're modest about capabilities, they admit their mistakes, create space for others to contribute as well. Inclusive leaders can show awareness of their own biases, right? They show awareness of personal blind spots as well as flaws in the system, and they work hard to ensure, meritocracy. They show curiosity about others, so they demonstrate an open mindset and deep curiosity about other folks. So they listen without judgment, they seek empathy, and understand those around them. They show cultural intelligence. And they're effective collaborators. So they empower others. They pay attention to diversity of thought and, psychological safety, and they focus on, team cohesion. So some strategies to achieve inclusion. Invest in skill building and strengths awareness, appreciation for different perspectives, right? Conflict resolution training and techniques, programs that focus on building relationships, create cultural awareness through book clubs at work, guest speakers, etc. And consider inviting your workforce to take a Be Welcoming course. We've got some information on those courses. They were actually created by Starbucks after a racial incident at one of their locations back, I think, in 2018. And they're fantastic. They're just really quick little webinars, and they're free. So we'll give you the information on those at the end of the session as well. Promote healthy relationships and friendships among colleagues through social or community involvement. Provide employees with the safe space to voice their concerns. Build trust by actively soliciting and responding to feedback. So examples, listening sessions with employees, employee surveys, anonymous reporting portals. Those are really important anyway. If you don't have one set up, it's a great idea. And then, how do you create a space for honest conversations, right? So if we're conducting listening sessions, what are we doing with that? How are we, helping folks to feel like they can come to a session like that and talk openly, right? So step 1, just listen, right? It's crucial to understand the current state of the company's culture, right? What you think as a leader the culture is, maybe it may feel a little bit different to the folks in the group. So be prepared to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? That's a really good way to genuinely start listening. Be prepared to hear some things that might not make you happy or satisfied with how the culture is going in your workplace. And after you listen, take action, right? Listening alone is not enough, but it forms the basis for taking action towards a more inclusive culture. So make sure your employees feel heard by showing that their feedback results in tangible improvements where necessary. Value all input. So not everyone is going to say things that you agree with, but company culture and what it means to belong feels different to different people. So when deciding where you're to focus your efforts, a truly inclusive, positive workplace culture will support both senior and junior employees, right? And it creates a sense of belonging for all. And then form two-way communication between leadership and employees, right? To foster an inclusive environment, it's really important that you don't just have one listening session or one employee survey, right? Follow up, make sure that employees feel like they can speak up anytime and be heard, right? Open two-way communication between employees and leadership strongly contributes to that type of positive work environment. So more strategies to achieve inclusion. Develop an inclusive decision-making process. So for an example, an all-white male leadership team makes decisions that are executed by a gender diverse group, right? Form a diverse committee to be a sounding board for leadership. Hold managers accountable to lead by example and to be the inclusion architect, right? Managers are really important, right? Is kind of that middle rung in the ladder between your more junior employees and in leadership. Quickly address any inappropriate behaviors and comments. Don't act like they didn't happen. It's really important, especially if an issue is widespread in the office and, throughout the culture, talk about it, address it, stop it, right? Celebrate important events, not just, the US, the bank holidays, right? Juneteenth, Gay Pride, International Day of Persons with Disabilities, International Women's Day. These are all fantastic things to celebrate that show your employees that you're, really thinking about them. Define and embrace inclusive language as an organization and hold each other accountable. So we'll talk a little bit more about kind of neutralizing our gender language here in a minute, but a good example is guys is not a gender neutral term. I struggle with that myself. If I'm on a Zoom call with a bunch of women, I might say, hey ladies, I refer to people as guys all the time. These are things that they're not gender neutral. Might mean nothing to me, but it might mean a lot to someone else, right? So, and I think that the golden rule is, yes, we want to show the communities that we serve and support that we're inclusive, but the first focus really has to be on the people that are already employed in your organization. So value their differences, create an environment where people can feel comfortable bringing their full selves to work with the folks that you already have as you work to increase, diversity and take steps to achieve inclusion. So a hot topic as of late, because of the recent Supreme Court ruling in June, is gender inclusive work environments, right? So we're going to talk about that in a little more specific. So the gender unicorn, we love to use the gender unicorn in our talks because it really does help us to explain and call out gender diversity as a whole. Right? So we'll talk about some terminology here using our gender unicorn. Gender identity, that refers to an individual's personal sense of having a particular gender, right? So a person's gender identity could be, female, male, or other, right? Gender expression can be different than gender identity. So it's the way in which a person expresses their gender identity, typically through their appearance, their dress, their behavior, what they wear, how they talk, etc. And then separate from gender identity and gender expression is sexual orientation, right? So a person's identity in relation to the gender or genders to which they're sexually attracted to, right? So somebody could be straight or heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, etc. And when you talk about sexual orientation, you've got, who somebody is physically attracted to and also who somebody is emotionally attracted to. So everyone has a gender identity, right? Most people never think about what their gender identity is because it matches their sex that they were assigned at birth, but that's not always the case. So in order to create a more inclusive work environment around gender identity, we just want to make sure that everyone feels really comfortable with several terms. So, we'll talk about things like birth name, right? That refers to the name that we were all given at birth. My birth name is Liza. The living name would refer to the name that a transgender or non-binary or a gender non-conforming person chooses to use, right? So dead naming then is the term for calling a trans or a non-binary gender non-conforming person by their former birth name if they've chosen a new living name. Dead naming is a form of harassment and discrimination. Gender dysphoria, that occurs when a person experiences serious emotional distress due to the gender that they are assigned at birth, differing from the gender that they know themselves to be. So not all trans folks or non-binary people experience gender dysphoria. It definitely, goes on a continuum. But for those that do, using incorrect pronouns, dead naming somebody can really contribute to their stress. So to create a gender inclusive work environment, use terms like cisgender or cis when you're speaking about folks who live as the sex that they were assigned at birth. If you use a term like normal to refer to a cisgendered person, it could be considered discriminatory, harassing, as it kind of sets apart those who are not cisgender, right, as being abnormal, right? Using preferred pronouns is a hugely important way to show respect for a person's gender identity. Consider adding a pronoun block to your organization's email signature. Some folks prefer he, him, or she, her pronouns, and others might prefer more gender neutral terms like they or them. Or they might be comfortable with several terms. So when you're in doubt, just ask, right? Create a culture where respect outweighs discomfort. What are your preferred pronouns? Very simple, right? Aware of how employees treat each other. So if you as a leader allow your employees to dead name each other, make jokes, inappropriate comments regarding gender identity, that could lead to unlawful harassment and a lawsuit coming across your desk, right? As soon as an employee announces their intent to transition, be prepared to respect their choice of name, pronouns, the restroom they want to use, etc. So you don't have to understand everything about a person to show them respect. Golden rule stuff. Okay, I've got a little video that I want to share. So I'm going to go ahead and share my computer sound so that everyone can hear this. Once I start playing, if you can't hear it, just let me know in chat, okay?
Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Wild and welcome to my channel, Ashley's Wild Life. This week on the Gender Resources playlist, what to do if you have accidentally misgendered someone. This video is inspired by the fact that I am misgendered almost constantly, and specifically motivated by something that happened to me this past week. I am in the waiting room at a doctor's office, waiting for the doctor to come out and tell me information about my mom. I've never seen the doctor before, she's never seen me before. We have only ever spoken on the phone. I am the only person in the waiting room, and suddenly a woman comes in, so I say, hi. She looks around the room and says, hi, and then leaves. Then I get a phone call, and it's the doctor. She says, hey, I'm not sure where you are. I looked for you in the waiting room. I'm like, well, I'm in the waiting room. So she says, oh, I must have missed you, and she comes back and she looks at me, and what she decides to say is, hey, pretty lady. What? This story sparked something for me, and what it sparked for me is how uncomfortable it makes people to treat trans individuals like regular human beings. If you misgender someone, you should treat it the way you would treat anything that you accidentally do that is rude. If you're a waitress and you're serving a table and you accidentally step on the toe of the customer, you don't stop and be like, great shoes. No, you politely apologize for stepping on their toe and you get back to the business of being a waitress. It was so uncomfortable and so isolating in that moment to feel like on top of misgendering me, which was an accident, but it still doesn't feel good. Now you're overcompensating, trying to get on my good side. This is a different conversation if we're talking about friends or family or someone who you are going to have a lasting relationship with, but this is a functional situation. Don't get on my good side. Apologize for the rude thing that you did, and then go back to treating me like a regular human being. I don't need a doctor to tell me I'm a pretty lady. I need a doctor to tell me how my mom is doing. I need you to treat me the same way you would treat anybody else. It's embarrassing when you realize that you've misgendered someone. And I get it. It's awkward. You don't know what to do. So here's what you do. Just apologize and treat me like a regular person. Because gender isn't visible, because it's something that we feel and we know about ourselves, misgendering will probably always happen. If you want to avoid misgendering to the best of your ability, ask someone what their pronouns are and how they would want to be referred to. But in any case, we all make mistakes. So just, if you misgender someone and you're uncomfortable, don't make your discomfort that person's problem. Apologize and let it go. Thank you all for watching. Bye-bye. I'm running a Patreon.
All right. Cool. So hopefully everyone could hear that really well. Little food for thought, right? So folks that handle being misgendered, you know, at work, out in the community, that can be really, obviously, you know, grating and uncomfortable for them.
On campaign.
Oh, well, good grief. There we go. Okay. So assumptions kill inclusivity, right? So, you know, don't ask folks, what does your husband or wife do, right? We're just assuming that because, you know, they're male, they have a wife, because they're female, they have a husband. Ask instead, what does your partner do, right? Don't assume gender identity based on perceived sex, right? Using she or he. You know, ask, what are your preferred pronouns? Perfectly acceptable question to ask. Don't ask invasive questions regarding a coworker's transition. If you know that you have, you know, someone in the workplace that has transitioned, is transitioning, right? Consider whether your question, your query is a need to know or nice to know, right? Need to know, you know, those are few and far between. Nice to know questions. Some folks, you know, in the trans or gender nonconforming community, really comfortable answering those, educating. Other folks just want to be seen as the gender that they feel inside. And so questions that, you know, are just nice to know can really put them off and add to gender dysphoria. You know, educate yourself. Ashley Wild has some great videos on YouTube. That's the person that we just saw. And there are many other ways to educate yourself about gender inclusivity as well. So if you have any other questions about gender inclusivity, stick them in the little Q&A box for the end of our session. And then we'll move on. We've talked about diversity and inclusivity strategies and best practices. So let's talk about equity next. Okay. So the intersection between equity and inclusion, you know, inclusion is the achievement of a work environment in which all individuals are treated fairly, respectfully, have equal access to opportunities and resources, and can contribute fully to the organization's success. So strategies to achieve racial and gender equity, compensation, right? So pay equity is so important. You know, Colorado's new Equal Pay for Equal Work Act goes into effect in January. There's a lot of work to be done around, you know, pay equity, pay transparency, right? Sharing pay ranges. Gender equity and racial equity in healthcare. Evaluate your healthcare plans that you offer to your employees to ensure that they support gender equity. So for example, same-sex spousal benefits, transgender medical care, etc. In the workplace, gender neutral restrooms are fantastic, and also accessible workspaces. So strategies to achieve racial and gender equity, a couple more things, career advancement and promotions, right? So post all your job openings internally, fairly compete the role. Even if you're pretty sure you know who you would like to see in that role, you know, it creates just a lot of kind of internal clamor, right? And feelings of inequity when people feel like, well, I didn't even get a chance, right? Post them all. Give everyone, you know, a week or two to let you know if they'd be interested in that role. Other recruiting practices, train hiring managers on equitable candidate evaluations, use interview guides and scoring tools just to take the guesswork out of it. Consider some skill-based hiring practices. So let's talk about skills-based hiring practices next. So what skills-based hiring practices are, it structures your company's hiring process around competencies. So the skills, the knowledge, the abilities that are necessary to do the job. So removes credential requirements for a lot of roles, right? You can't do this for every single role. But whenever possible, removes those credential requirements, uses competencies specific to the job to define the hiring process, and reduces bias to remove barriers for qualified applicants. So educational attainment of adults 25 and older here. Skills-based hiring is really necessary because there's an inequity in education, right? So we take a look at, all racial groups, who has less than a high school diploma, who's got the, the master's degree, who has professional and doctorate degrees, right? There is definitely inequity between the races. So there is not equal access to education. So how is a skills-based job posting different than a regular job posting, right? So you could see in a pedigree-based or a traditional job posting uses credentials. Now, sometimes we have to have those credentials, right? In a medical situation, for example, in healthcare, et cetera, you gotta have the degree, right? You have to have those credentials. But for other roles, they use competencies, right? In a skills-based job posting as opposed to credentials, right? A pedigree-based job posting has a list of qualifications, and a skills-based job posting distinguishes qualifications between what's required and what's preferred, right? Not just here are these specific things that you have to have, right? Here's what you have to have in the skills base, and here's what it's a nice to have, right? But it's not absolutely necessary. With a pedigree-based job posting, the outcome is always unintentional bias, right? Even if we don't mean to. Because it creates barriers to applicants that would otherwise be qualified. So let's look at a sample job posting. So I'm going to pull up a PDF on my screen, and we're going to look at, a pedigree job posting, and then we'll look at a skills-based job posting, right? So the big differences that you're going to see or when you come down here to your qualifications, right? So let's make that a little bigger. Okay. So in a pedigree job posting requires a BAA, BS in a related field, right? This is for, by the way, this is for a recruiter, right? So this is your person in HR who is handling the talent acquisition for your organization. So requires a bachelor's degree in a related field for a recruiter, minimum of 1 year experience working in a recruiting environment, exceptional interpersonal and communication skills, great analytical skills, proficient using the internet as a recruitment source, sense of urgency is helpful, financially driven, energetic, etc. Okay. So the same job posting, but more of a skills-based approach. Again, same job for a recruiter. Required competencies. Instead of up here, sorry to flip back and forth, qualifications, right? Competencies. Interview and assessment techniques, process improvement, interpersonal skills, judgment and decision-making, writing. These are the must-haves, right? We can figure out if folks have these competencies through interview questions, through pre and post interview assessments, etc. And then preferred competencies. Hey, these are the things you have to have and required. We'd also prefer you to have some knowledge of employment law. It's really important when you're working in a recruiting capacity. We'd love you to understand how to use the recruitment software that we use. We'd love you to have, some persistence, some persuasion to help get those top candidates in the door, right? A little bit different. So we've taken a look at kind of the pedigree-based posting and a skills-based posting. So the big question is, should education for that recruiting position be a key requirement? So got another poll. I'd love to hear just yes or no. We'll go ahead and launch this poll. Should education be a key requirement for that position? We'll give everyone, you know, another, 10 seconds or so to answer that. Okay, cool. So we'll end the poll. We'll share the results. So 38% of you said that education should indeed be a key requirement for a recruiter position. 62% of you said no, you don't think it should be a key requirement. So, you know, I think this illustrates a really important point. You know, there are going to be differences in every organization on how far into skills-based hiring and recruiting you can go, you want to go, you know, what's appropriate per job. Again, if you're recruiting for a nurse practitioner, yeah, you know, the degree's probably the education's pretty important, right? If you're recruiting for somebody who is a clerical staff, you know, something along those lines, probably not as important, right? Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop sharing those poll results. So we talked a little bit about bias language earlier, right? Without realizing it, we all use language that is subtly gender coded, right? So society has expectations of what men and women are like, what we should be doing in the workplace, etc. And that seeps into the language that we use. So even if you're not moving to a skills-based approach to talent acquisition, you can still, you know, gender decode the language that's in your job ads and in your job descriptions really quickly. There's a gender decoder here. We'll include the link when we send out the deck. And this can be really helpful just to take a look at, do you have subtle gender coding in your ads already? Okay, awesome. So let's move on to kind of wrapping it all together. So we've talked about different strategies for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's talk about how we put that all together and build our DE&I strategy. So 3 steps, we'll talk about these separately. So first we evaluate, where do we need to go? What are the key things we need to work on? We're going to design our strategy, and then this is great. We've evaluated, we've designed it. Now we have to launch it, make it happen, right? So first and foremost, when we evaluate our strategy, let's consider, where are your gaps, right? Is your gap diversity, equity, or inclusion? Remember, we talked in the beginning about, you know, we don't have to boil the ocean. Maybe you're already a really diverse group. That's fantastic. So now work on equity, work on inclusion as it makes sense. Identify your objectives, right? So where can DE&I complement your current business strategy? Solicit input from your employees. So a climate survey to understand and align your employees on your organizational strengths and gaps. Because remember, you know, those folks in leadership positions don't always have, you know, the best knowledge of what's happening on the ground. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Ask your employees what their input is. And then narrow down the top 2 or 3 focus areas. Don't bite off more than you can chew. So we've evaluated where we need to go. So now let's design our strategy. So focus on outcomes that move your business forward. So not just initiatives, right? For the sake of initiatives. So remember that DE&I strategies are interrelated. For example, if your gap is diversity, focus on building an inclusive work environment. And when you launch your diversity recruiting strategy, your organization is ready to embrace your new hires, right? Create a recruiting strategy that brings diversity to key roles, different levels, departments, where it's, you know, necessary, where it's lacking. And then when you're ready to launch, draft a statement that outlines your organization's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So identify the immediate focus areas that complement your current business strategy, and then also share your long-term goals. Launch an internal campaign to communicate your commitment and strategy with your internal employees first. So identify how your employees can contribute to your strategy, and both in action and in behavior. Share also externally by highlighting your commitments through your website, marketing strategy, job ads, etc. And ground your DE&I commitment in your core values. So this is how one organization has aligned, their diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy to their core values, right? We consider the bigger picture, knowing our work goes beyond ourselves. We seek balance by taking into account multiple perspectives, listening deeply. We're not afraid of the less traveled path if it holds true to our values, betters the world. We advocate for diverse backgrounds and perspectives to make our team and products stronger. We work to create an inclusive environment to build a better company, set a positive example for the world. And then they have some information on their website about, ways we can act on diversity and inclusion. So reevaluate your core values, right? Once you've identified your DE&I strategy, and demonstrate your commitment both internally and externally by really, blasting those core values out there. So some key takeaways. So DE&I enhances your business strategy. Incorporate it as a foundation in your daily business conversations. Do your part to create a positive and inclusive working environment. Reflect your organizational values in every interaction. Be alert to inappropriate conduct, right? So as we're talking about equity and inclusion in the workplace, are there things that are really running contrary to that right now? Be alert to that. Quickly hold others accountable and engage with your manager or HR right away as things concerns arise, etc. So the deeper learning opportunity that we spoke about earlier, Starbucks has the To Be Welcoming series that they created in response to a racial issue at one of their stores in 2008. It's in partnership with Arizona State University. Really fantastic content, right? Just for yourself. You may pick a few that you would like your team to look at, all free, and we definitely welcome you to check it out. Okay. All right, so let's talk about our Q&A. So we have one question. There's still time. If there's anything else that you would like to ask or discuss, plenty of time. But we'll go ahead and answer our one question. How do you recommend balancing hiring the highest qualified applicant and DE&I strategies? Yeah. I think that's a really good place to start when you're talking about talent acquisition. You've got multiple people that are qualified for the role. And now we're not saying that you should go out and, hire someone just because of diversity, right? You don't want to hire someone just because they're Black, just because they're LGBT, just because they're female, etc. But if you have two candidates that are equally qualified, when you look at it from a skills-based perspective, when that makes sense, then diversity may be that tipping point, right? Again, when we talk about, diversity in hiring, it's not hiring just because the person is diverse, right? But use that as kind of the deciding factor if you need one, right, between two qualified candidates. Also, make sure that on the front end you're getting the qualified candidates into your applicant pool, right? Reach out to diverse communities, reach out to maybe smaller, more niche recruiting firms to help you in job searches. Advertise in diverse, newspapers, newsletters, websites, etc., so that you're attracting that diverse talent. And then, of course, when you have your beautiful new DE&I strategy rolled out, be loud about it, right? Make sure that folks externally know that that is something that you're working on, you're striving towards, that is important to you, and then you'll start to attract more diverse candidates. So I hope that really, helped answer that question. It was a good one. Any other questions, comments? Okay, cool. I really enjoyed walking through this session with everyone today. Thank you for your participation in the polls. You will be directed to a brief survey as soon as the webinar closes today via SurveyMonkey. If you could just please take 2 minutes, answer the survey, provide your feedback. We would love to know, if this training was useful to you, if you'd like to see trainings like this in the future, and any other comments that you have for us. So again, thank you so much, everyone. Take care and enjoy your weekend.